There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a neighborhood at 6 a.m. That gray, misty quiet right before the world wakes up. But on this particular Tuesday, that silence was shattered not by a rooster or a garbage truck, but by the sweet, rhythmic metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around the wrists of a woman who thought she was untouchable. I was standing there on my porch, gripping a ceramic mug of coffee that was still steaming hot, watching my wife, Elena, who looks like a yoga instructor but hits like a freight train, read rights to the president of our homeowners association, while the woman screamed about property values and conspiracies. It's funny, looking back, how Brenda Sterling spent 6 months treating our lives like her personal ant farm, shaking the jar just to watch us panic, never realizing that the quiet woman driving the nondescript sedan wasn't just a night shift nurse or a weary insomniac, but a 15-year veteran of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department who sleeps with a badge within arm's reach. You always hear about nightmare neighbors, about the petty tyrants who measure grass with a ruler. But let me tell you, when you accidentally declare war on a woman who specializes in taking down organized crime rings, you aren't just poking the bear, you're climbing into the cage covered in honey. Let's rewind the tape, take it back to the beginning, back to when Mike Henderson, a 42-year-old grease monkey who spent his life under the hoods of F-150s, and Elena, my brilliant steel-spined wife, decided to move into Oak Creek Manor in Santa Clarita, California. We wanted peace. We wanted a sanctuary, especially for Elena because her shifts are brutal, sometimes swinging from late afternoon until the sun comes up, filled with the kind of human darkness that makes you crave a quiet street and a boring lawn. We bought this modest, 3-bedroom ranch-style house. Nothing flashy, just a place to park my boots and her service weapon. And for the first few weeks, it felt like we'd made it, like we had finally grabbed a slice of the American dream. I drive a beat-up but beloved 2016 Chevy Silverado, fully loaded with my tool chests and ladder racks because I run a mobile mechanic business, and Elena drives an unmarked, charcoal gray sedan that screams, government issue, if you know what to look for. But to the untrained eye, it's just a car. Enter Brenda Sterling. If you looked up suburban dictator in the dictionary, you'd find her picture, likely taken from a low angle to make her look taller, wearing a pastel blazer that costs more than my truck payments. She was 50-something, a retired claims adjuster who had weaponized her knowledge of bureaucracy into a cudgel, ruling Oak Creek Manor for 8 years with an iron fist and a clipboard that she wielded like a scepter. The first time she descended upon us, I was unloading a compressor from my truck bed, the morning air crisp and smelling of freshly cut fescue, and suddenly I was hit by a wave of overpowering lavender perfume and the clicking of sensible heels on my driveway. She didn't introduce herself, didn't offer a welcome basket or a smile. She just stood there, tapping a pen against her clipboard, looking at my truck with the kind of disgust usually reserved for roadkill. "This is a residential zone, Mr. Henderson," she announced, her voice possessing that nasal, piercing quality that cuts through engine noise, not a salvage yard. I tried to be polite. I tried to be the good neighbor, explaining that I lived here, that this was my personal vehicle which I also used for work, thinking we were having a misunderstanding, but she just whipped out a laminated sheet of rules, Section 4.7 of the bylaws, citing weight limits and commercial restrictions. She told me I had 48 hours to remove the eyesore or face fines, and as she walked away, I noticed she wasn't just looking at the truck, she was photographing Elena's car, zooming in on our license plates, documenting the time, her eyes scanning our property like a predator looking for a limp. When I told Elena about it later, she was exhausted, eyes rimmed with red from a double shift, and she just shrugged it off, saying she deals with real criminals and can't be bothered by a woman with too much time on her hands. But the cop in her, that instinct that keeps her alive on the streets, woke up a few days later when the violations started arriving in the mail like confetti. It wasn't just the truck, it was a fine for unapproved parking because Elena pulled into the driveway at 4 a.m. It was a citation for landscape deficiencies because of a patch of clover in the backyard that wasn't even visible from the street. Elena looked at the stack of paper, her brow furrowing, and she said quietly, "This isn't about rules, Mike. This is about dominance. This is behavior modification." And that night, instead of sleeping, we sat at the kitchen table under the hum of the refrigerator light, dissecting the HOA covenants like it was a cold case file. We found the exemption clause, hidden deep in the appendix, stating that personal work vehicles were allowed if they didn't conduct business on the premises, which meant we were legal. But when I sent a polite, fact-based email to the board, Brenda's response was to call an emergency meeting. It was a sham, a total farce attended only by her cronies, Arthur Pemsley, the treasurer who looked like a nervous ferret in a cheap suit, and Susan Miller, a secretary who looked like she was being held hostage. They passed an emergency amendment, specifically targeting my truck, bypassing the required 30-day notice, bypassing the community vote, just rewriting the laws of our neighborhood because Brenda didn't like the look of my bumper. I started talking to the neighbors, trying to get the lay of the land, and that's when I met Tom Russo, a retired history teacher living 2 doors down, a man with kind eyes and a defeated posture. When I mentioned Brenda, he laughed, a dry, bitter sound, and invited me inside to show me his Brenda file, a collection of misery that proved we weren't special, we were just the latest targets. He told me about Sarah Kim, the nurse across the street who was fined for having a tricycle on her porch, and Marcus Hayes, a combat veteran who was harassed until he sold his house because he parked his motorcycle in the driveway. The pattern was so clear it was blinding. She targeted the working class, the minorities, the people who didn't drive luxury German cars, anyone who didn't fit her visual aesthetic of a perfect community. The breaking point, the moment this stopped being a nuisance and started being a war, was the hearing at Brenda's house. We showed up, Elena in her civilian clothes, looking calm and observant, while Brenda sat behind a mahogany desk like she was presiding over the Supreme Court, flanked by Arthur and Susan. She threw photos of our cars at us, timestamps of Elena's late-night arrivals, claiming neighbors were complaining about suspicious activity, and when I asked to see the complaints, she smirked and claimed confidentiality. Then, she pulled out a property survey, a document that claimed my driveway was encroaching on a utility easement, a document that looked official until Elena, who deals with warrants and legal paperwork daily, leaned in. "Can I see the stamp on that survey?" Elena asked, her voice dropped dead even, and Brenda bristled, asking who she thought she was, to which Brenda made the mistake of saying, "Maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit for people of your background." The air left the room, sucked out by the sheer audacity of her prejudice, and I saw Elena's eyes shift, a subtle hardening, the mental switch flipping from annoyed homeowner to investigator building a RICO case. She stood up, signaled for us to leave, and as we walked to the car, Brenda called out that we'd better get a lawyer, not knowing she had just handed a loaded gun to the best detective I know. "That survey was forged," Elena said as we pulled out of the driveway, her knuckles white on the dashboard. "And that comment? That's a hate crime enhancement if we can prove a pattern." She looked at me, and I saw the fire, the cold, calculating fury of a woman who protects the vulnerable for a living. "Mike, she's not just a bully. She's a criminal, and she has no idea she's currently under investigation by the Riverside Sheriff's newest unofficial task force, me." The atmosphere in our house shifted from defense to offense, transforming our dining room table into something resembling a situation room in a spy thriller, covered in maps, financial statements, and timelines connected by invisible strings of logic. Elena was in her element, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a predator stalking prey, instructing me to document every interaction, every glance, every time Brenda walked past our house with that cursed clipboard. It wasn't just about parking anymore. We were pulling on a thread that we suspected was attached to a much larger, uglier tapestry of corruption that had been smothering Oak Creek Manor for nearly a decade. Brenda, growing desperate because we hadn't buckled under her initial barrage of fines, decided to escalate her tactics into what I can only describe as psychological warfare. She started timing her inspections to coincide with Elena's sleep schedule, parking herself on the sidewalk right outside our bedroom window at noon, talking loudly on her phone, dragging garbage cans back and forth, anything to disrupt the rest of a first responder. It infuriated me, seeing my wife, who spends her nights wrestling domestic abusers and drunk drivers, tossing and turning because a retired insurance adjuster needed a power trip, but Elena just whispered, "Let her dig. Mike, every act of harassment is another line in the affidavit." Then came the physical escalation, the moment the Cold War turned hot. I walked out to my truck one morning to find deep, jagged scratches along the passenger door and 2 roofing nails propped perfectly against my rear tires, waiting to blow out my sidewalls on the freeway. We installed cameras that weekend, high-definition eyes watching every corner of our property, and sure enough, the footage caught Brenda and her treasurer, Arthur Pemsley, prowling around our lot at 3 a.m. with flashlights and measuring tape, looking like villains from a bad cartoon. But it wasn't funny. It was stalking, it was trespassing, and when Elena reviewed the footage, pointing out how they were assessing our property lines, a dark realization washed over her face. "Why is the treasurer measuring our lot?" she asked, zooming in on Arthur, who was sweating even in the cool night air. "Treasurers handle money, not land surveys." I decided to do some digging of my own, channeling my inner detective, fueled by caffeine and spite. I pulled public records, court dockets, and property transfer histories, spending hours staring at screens until my eyes burned, and what I found made my blood run cold. Brenda Sterling wasn't just a nightmare neighbor. She was a serial litigant who had sued people in 3 previous neighborhoods, always following the same pattern: target a family, harass them with HOA violations, drive them to sell, and then vanish. But the smoking gun, the piece of the puzzle that locked it all together, was Arthur Pemsley. Arthur held a real estate license, and when I cross-referenced the homes sold by Brenda's previous victims, guess whose shell companies bought them up for pennies on the dollar? It was a pump-and-dump scheme, a real estate fraud ring masquerading as a homeowners association. Brenda would make life a living hell for vulnerable families, minorities, veterans, people like Marcus and Sarah, creating a distressed property, and then Arthur would swoop in like a vulture, offering a lowball cash buyout to save them from the misery, flipping the house for a massive profit once the harassment mysteriously stopped. We called a secret meeting, a neighborhood barbecue that was actually a council of war, inviting Tom, Sarah, Marcus, and a few others who we knew were on the hit list. The tension in our backyard was palpable, a mix of fear and anger, as Elena, stripping away the neighborly facade and stepping into her command presence, laid out the evidence. She showed them the financial records Tom had pulled, revealing that the HOA reserve fund was missing nearly $30,000, siphoned off into consulting fees paid to companies owned by Arthur. She explained the racketeering statutes, the civil rights violations, the fraud, speaking with such authority that Sarah actually gasped and asked, "Are you a lawyer?" Something like that. Elena smiled, keeping her cover but giving them the confidence to fight. We formed a plan, a 3-pronged attack: document the abuse, rally the community for a vote of no confidence, and lure Brenda into a public trap where she couldn't hide behind email threats. Brenda, sensing the shift in the wind, went nuclear. She filed complaints with code enforcement, claiming I was running an illegal chop shop. She called animal control on neighbors who didn't even own pets. She even called the police on me, filing a false report claiming I had physically threatened her in my driveway. That was her fatal mistake. The officer who responded was a rookie, but Elena's partner, Detective Thorne, caught wind of the call and intercepted it. He had to recuse himself officially, but he made sure the rookie saw our security footage that showed me at my shop, miles away, at the exact time Brenda claimed I was threatening her. Filing a false police report is a crime, a serious one, and Brenda had just handed us the handcuffs on a silver platter. But we waited. Elena wanted the kill shot to be public. She wanted the community to see the monster unmasked so that the fear would break forever. We organized a massive HOA meeting, renting out the community center, bypassing Brenda's attempt to hold it in her living room. We flyered the neighborhood. We made phone calls. We ensured that every single person who had ever felt the sting of Brenda's gaze would be there. The night before the meeting, Arthur Pemsley showed up at Tom Russo's door, sweating bullets, and offered him $50,000 over market value for his house if he would just stop this nonsense and move. Tom, the retired teacher with a spine of steel, recorded the entire conversation. Attempted bribery, witness intimidation. The noose was tightening, and they didn't even know the executioner was sleeping across the street. "Tomorrow," Elena said, polishing her badge which she had tucked into her purse, "we end this. Not just for us, but for every family they bullied out of their home." The community center was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the humidity of 60 bodies, and the static electricity of suppressed rage. We had people standing along the back walls, neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in years united by a common enemy, all watching as Brenda Sterling marched to the front of the room with Arthur and Susan trailing behind her like doomed court jesters. Brenda looked pale, her eyes darting around the room, realizing too late that this wasn't her controlled environment. This was a revolution. She tried to grab the microphone, her voice shrill, screeching that the meeting was illegal, that we were a mob, that she was the only legitimate authority in Oak Creek Manor. But Tom Russo simply stepped up, cited the California Civil Code regarding emergency homeowner meetings, and was elected chair by a landslide show of hands that looked like a tidal wave crashing down on her head. We presented the case like a high-stakes courtroom drama. I projected the timeline of harassment on a screen, the photos of the stalking, the forged survey, while Sarah read the medical reports of the stress-induced anxiety her children suffered. Then Tom dropped the financial bomb, projecting the bank statements showing the money flowing from our reserve funds directly into Arthur's pockets. The room erupted, a low growl of anger turning into shouts of thief and fraud. Brenda snapped. The pressure, the exposure, the crumbling of her little kingdom was too much for her narcissism to handle. She leaped up, knocking her chair over, and pointed a shaking finger directly at me and Elena, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You don't belong here," she screamed, her voice cracking, spraying spittle. "I know everything about you. I know when you sleep. I know where you work. I will ruin you. I will make sure you lose that house and end up on the street. I will bury you in lawsuits until you can't afford to breathe." The room went deathly silent. She had just publicly admitted to stalking and uttered criminal threats in front of 60 witnesses. It was the moment Elena had been waiting for, the moment the trap snapped shut. Elena stood up slowly from the third row. She didn't look like a tired night shift worker anymore. She looked like the hand of God. She walked into the aisle, her movement precise and fluid, and her voice, though not shouting, carried to every corner of that room with terrifying clarity. "Brenda Sterling," Elena said. "I am Deputy Elena Henderson of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department." The color drained from Brenda's face so fast it looked like her soul had left her body. Elena pulled out her badge, the gold shield catching the overhead fluorescent lights, beaming like a star. "You have just made criminal threats in my presence," Elena continued, closing the distance, "and admitted to a campaign of stalking and harassment. Furthermore, we have evidence of filing false police reports, fraud, and conspiracy." Brenda started to stammer, backing away, hitting the table, mumbling about how she didn't know, about how this was entrapment, but the reality was crashing down on her. Detective Thorne and 2 uniformed officers, who had been waiting in the lobby, pushed through the doors. Arthur Pemsley tried to bolt for the back exit, but was intercepted by an officer who already had a warrant for his arrest regarding the real estate fraud. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting onto Brenda's wrists was the loudest sound in the world, followed immediately by the thunderous applause of the neighborhood. It was cathartic, it was cinematic, it was the physical manifestation of justice. Brenda was led out, weeping, her blazer rumpled, her power stripped away, leaving just a sad, corrupt criminal. The aftermath was a scorched earth cleansing of Oak Creek Manor. Arthur flipped on Brenda immediately to save his own skin, revealing the entire depth of the fraud scheme, implicating them in crimes across the county. He went to prison for 4 years. Brenda got 2 years and a permanent restraining order from ever holding a position of authority in a housing association again, plus restitution that wiped out her savings. We elected a new board with Tom as president, and I, the mechanic with the truck, was voted in as secretary, primarily to burn the old rulebook and write a new one based on common sense. But as I watched the sun set over our quiet, peaceful street a few months later, watching Elena finally sleep soundly without fear of a clipboard-wielding maniac, I couldn't help but think about the fragility of it all. We won because my wife carried a badge, because we knew the law, because we had the resources to fight back. But what about the families before us? What about the people Brenda crushed who didn't have a sheriff in the bedroom? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is justice truly blind? Or does it only open its eyes when the victim holds a shield? We got our happy ending, and the bad guys went to jail, but in a world full of Brendas, How many people are losing their homes right now because they don't have the power to say you're under arrest? That's the question that keeps me up at night, even now that the neighborhood is safe. But for today, the coffee tastes good, the truck is parked in the driveway, and the only thing clicking in the morning is the sound of birds, not handcuffs.